When a veteran's making a claim for Gulf War syndrome, what are some of the challenges and considerations?
There are certainly challenges. A study by the VA's own Inspector General, if I remember right, it's in 2017, found that the VA turns down about 80% of these claims because they just don't understand this Gulf War syndrome stuff. But that's the challenge.
And did they specify if that was at the regional office or at the board or just on the whole?
That's the initial claims at the regional office. And the way you deal with that, obviously, is in two parts. First, you have to have a very good record of the symptoms. You know, it's incumbent upon the veteran himself or herself to keep a record of these different symptoms, because these are not the kind of symptoms you can establish with an X-ray or a blood test.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Hello, and welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to understanding VA disability benefits. This is our podcast to help veterans understand how to obtain the maximum allowable veterans benefit for their particular condition. And who are we? Well, I'm Francis Jackson. This is Kristian Terison. We're from the law firm of Jackson and MacNichol, where we specialize in getting justice for veterans on their VA disability claims. What's this about? Well, today we're going to talk about what's sometimes known as Gulf War Syndrome or Persian Gulf Syndrome, and we're going to talk about how the VA handles that type of disability. And who's this show for? Well, obviously it's for veterans, and today's episode is specifically for those who served in the Middle East between August 2nd, 1990 and December 31st, 2021, which is the period for which the Gulf War presumption applies. And we're going to walk through how that works and who it applies to. But this podcast series is really just for folks who care about veterans, whether you're a veteran or a spouse of a veteran or a relative, or just someone in the community who cares about helping veterans. This is the podcast for you. So without further ado, let's get into today's show.
All right. Well, to begin with, can you talk a little bit about Gulf War syndrome and the typical symptoms associated with it?
Sure. What happened, starting with folks assigned in the Middle East in 1990 and thereafter, was previously healthy young veterans would come back to the U.S., get out of service, and they would have this range of weird symptoms. Nothing that the doctors could really put a finger on. And some of those symptoms would be things like unexplained weight loss, unexplained fatigue, muscle or joint pain, headaches, menstrual disorders for women, psychological or neurological problems, respiratory disturbances, sleep disturbances, and even skin disorders. And eventually, it became clear that this problem was so widespread that it had to be dealt with. And ultimately, Congress passed a statute in Title 38, Section 1117, and allowed for benefits for this particular kind of problem. And the VA then, in turn, created a regulation, 38 CFR 3.317, that deals with this issue.
All right. So when a veteran's making a claim for Gulf War syndrome, what are some of the challenges and considerations?
There are certainly challenges. A study by the VA's own Inspector General, if I remember right, it's in 2017, found that the VA turns down about 80% of these claims because they just don't understand this Gulf War syndrome stuff. But that's that's the challenge.
And did they specify if that was at the regional office or at the board or just on the whole?
That's the initial claims at the regional office.
Okay.
And the way you deal with that, obviously, is in two parts. First, you have to have a very good record of the symptoms. It's incumbent upon the veteran himself or herself to keep a record of these different symptoms, because these are not the kind of symptoms you can establish with an x-ray or a blood test. Mm-hmm. So you have to keep notes about what was your weight, how much weight did you lose, what days were you so tired that you really just couldn't function? Are you now having heart issues? And if so, what are the details of those? Are you having muscle or joint pain? How often do you have it? Where do you have it? Are you having headaches? Have you developed these psychological or neurological problems? Are you having trouble breathing? Are you having trouble sleeping? Are you having skin rashes that come and go? All those things have to be carefully logged over a period of time if you're going to make a viable claim for Gulf War syndrome. But in addition to that, you need medical evidence, and it's an unusual kind of medical evidence. You need medical evidence from one or more doctors saying that they can't figure out why you have all these symptoms. Mm. The whole point of this Persian Gulf Syndrome is that you have what are essentially unexplained symptoms in an otherwise healthy person that simply shouldn't exist, but they're existing. So it's important to make note of those. And the VA has broken this into a couple parts. They talk about a qualifying chronic disability, and they also talk about unexplained, medically unexplained, chronic multi-symptom illness, referred to as a MUCMI, M-U-C-M-I. So those are kind of the big categories, if you will, for Persian Gulf War syndrome. And the undiagnosed illness category has these symptoms we talked about, but the qualifying chronic disability one, that is a little easier to get your arms around. Some of the conditions that qualify include chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, functional gastrointestinal disorders, meaning disorders in the GI system that have no discernible medical basis. That's what the medical folks mean by functional. And also certain infectious diseases. There's a specific list of East Asian medical conditions that we don't ordinarily see in the U.S. Things like West Nile virus, non-typhoid salmonella, certain kinds of tuberculosis, brucellosis, lots of diseases that are just not common in the U.S. that fall in that category.
Okay. So are there specific tests or evaluations that the VA is looking for when it comes to a claim like this? I know that part of it sounds like the symptoms that defy any sort of objective imaging or testing, things like that.
Yeah, the only area where the VA is looking for specific test results is in the area of these unusual infectious diseases. We can test for things like brucellosis or West Nile virus and so on. Mm-hmm. So if you're falling in that little category of the unusual infectious diseases, then they would expect a test verifying the existence. But the reason that the VA has so much trouble with these cases is that the rest of this stuff is so amorphous. If you come in to your doctor and say, doctor, I'm having headaches and I'm losing some weight and I'm tired all the time, that may well be Gulf War syndrome. But those symptoms are so generic that it's very hard for the VA to say, well, this is Gulf War syndrome and not you're just run down and sick. And so lots of these claims get denied because it's just very difficult to get your hands around them.
Well, and it sounds like longitudinal evidence over time is really critical to this type of claim.
That's the key. And some of these claims go on for a very long time because it takes a long time to develop a real history of ongoing intermittent problems of these various types that are in combination disabling, but your doctor's not going to say, well, you have a disabling heart problem or you have some other disabling condition, because none of these fall into those categories. It's the additive nature of, well, you've got headaches and you've got fatigue and you've got joint pain and you've got some neurological problems. And when you add those all together, they're very debilitating. But it's very hard for anybody to really put a finger on any of those. So it's an ongoing problem with this unexplained chronic multi-symptom illness, undiagnosed illness kind of category. And one of the things that is particularly ironic about it is when doctors do put labels on things, say you have fatigue, then the VA will respond, well, this isn't undiagnosed. You've been found to have fatigue. So it's
a really a catch-22, because
it really is.
You need a diagnosis for at least one component to succeed with the disability claim, but by the same token, getting that diagnosis, at least at the regional office level, they'll look at that and say, well, it's not Gulf War syndrome, it's chronic fatigue, it's fibromyalgia.
Right. So it can be a real catch-22. Some of these cases really just drag on for a very long time because of the combination of the elusive nature of the symptoms, the lack of any diagnosis, and the VA's difficulty in putting that together and accepting it as Gulf War syndrome.
And I know with a lot of chronic disorders, things that a lot of veterans aren't going to see a doctor for time and again because the symptoms are fairly static. They're, recurring, debilitating, but they're not changing and they're not getting worse, they're not improving.
Right.
And so, if you're not going to the doctor, there's no record being created. So, we advise a lot of folks, keep a journal.
That's
because, writing down, as you mentioned earlier, weights, dates and times of different episodes and the onset of symptoms, things like that, can be very powerful evidence in a claim like this.
In fact, they're really about the only way you can prove claims like this. And as you were saying, most veterans don't want to go to the doctor every week and say, Doc, I'm still having fatigue. After you've told the doctor that 10 times, you're reluctant to go and tell him the 11th time. So it's a problem. As you were pointing out, one of the biggest problems in this area is a lack of medical documentation, which is why we have to rely on journals and lists of symptoms. But it's a really difficult area for proving veterans benefits, proving eligibility for veterans benefits.
And so, we've talked a little bit about how it's a heavy lift, but where does the presumption come into play?
Well, the presumption is that if you have this range of unexplained symptoms, then you're entitled to benefits. But the hard part is convincing the VA that you have a range of unexplained symptoms that isn't a diagnosis, that falls within the presumption, and you should get the benefit of it. It's a real challenge.
It's really threading the needle, especially with requiring one of the diagnosed chronic conditions as well. And the tendency, at least at the regional office level, to want to put all the symptoms under that umbrella.
Well, at least, the chronic conditions that qualify, like fibromyalgia, even though doctors can't tell you what causes fibromyalgia or really how it works even, they now have a working definition and can say, okay, we've excluded all these other things and you have fibromyalgia or you have chronic fatigue. But with these other multi-symptom ones, it's even tougher.
What would you say are some of the common misconceptions about Gulf War syndrome that are out there?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that it's not real. There is a serious misconception, and sadly you see it sometimes among the folks at the VA who are working on these claims, that this is not a real thing, that this is all just kind of made up stuff. And that's not true, but there are certainly people that believe it, just as there are people who believe that fibromyalgia is not a real thing, because there's no definitive way to test for it. The VA likes things that you can see and evaluate and test for. You get a blood test back, or you get an X-ray or an MRI, or you have some poor soul who comes in who had his foot blown off when an IED exploded. They can see that. They can rate it. Those claims get handled pretty straightforwardly. But things like this are just so amorphous. It's very difficult for them to kind of get their arms around it.
How can some of the environmental exposures for those who served in the Gulf complicate the disability claims process for Gulf War syndrome?
Well, as you know, there's recently enacted legislation called the PACT Act. And one of the things that the PACT Act does is to create some presumptions based on exposures. For the Gulf War folks, it's primarily exposure to the burn pits. And so one of the unintended consequences, I think, of the PACT Act is that the VA is tempted to channel some of these cases into, well, you've got a respiratory problem, we can label that under the PACT Act, we can say that you have chronic sinusitis from that, and so that's what the label we're going to use, and we're going to rate that, and that's what you get. Without recognizing that there's a much larger problem of Gulf War syndrome here. A 10% rating for sinusitis isn't very meaningful for a veteran who has Gulf War syndrome and is so debilitated that he can't work. 10% doesn't go very far. That's less than $200 a month.
So what steps should a veteran take if they believe they have Gulf War syndrome?
Well, I think there are three things that you need to do to effectively present these cases. The first, as you mentioned, is a journal or diary or list of the symptoms over a period of at least 6 months, minimum of 6 months, preferably a year. Second, visits to the doctor, explaining each of the symptoms and getting the doctor to record A, the symptoms, and B, the fact that there is no obvious medical explanation for the symptom, that none of the conditions that typically cause those symptoms are present. And the third thing I think you have to do with these cases is you have to get an expert to work with you to present them. People who present these cases on their own almost inevitably lose. So, there are folks out there in the veteran service organizations, there are agents, there are attorneys who have seriously dealt with these problems in multiple cases and understand how to go about documenting them and presenting them and getting the critical piece of medical evidence which says that here are all the symptoms and this is an undiagnosed illness. But it's a hard one for doctors to write. They want to put labels on things. And it's very difficult for them to say that we can't figure out what this is. But that's what you ultimately have to have in these cases, is a medical opinion that says, well, there are all these pieces, and when you put them all together, it's Gulf War syndrome, because we can't identify a specific cause for these things.
Yeah, there's nothing tougher than proving the absence of something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time for today. Thank you for tuning in. This has been another episode of Victory Over VA. Please be sure to subscribe and join us next week.
We hope to see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.